Hello and welcome to this Catalogue Week presentation. My name is Elizabeth Haines and I work at the National Archives UK in the Collections Expertise and Engagement Department as Team Leader, Overseas and Defence. The quote that is the title of this presentation describes the uncertainty about the political status of two brothers, Sion and Kadori Hanania, in the words of their London lawyers, Gaskett, Metcalfe and Walton, in 1921. In their letter, which is now in the records of the Colonial Office in the National Archives, the lawyers complain that they are unable to advise their clients. We find it impossible to tell them whether they are at the present time British subjects or French subjects or Arabs. The only thing that seems certain is that they are no longer Turks. Claims to national identity can frequently be complicated, but this one appeared particularly tricky. The Hanania brothers were born in Baghdad. They were educated in a French school in Baghdad and they were now resident in France. At the time of their birth, Baghdad had been part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1921, however, it was now part of the British Mandate for Mesopotamia, and in October 1922 it became the Kingdom of Iraq. In this moment of change, what was the Hanania brothers' status? Which country might offer them legal protection? The history of the British administration of Iraq began at the end of the First World War and was crystallized in the Treaty of Sèvres, which was signed with the defeated Ottoman Empire in 1920. Iraq was one of a number of territories that were taken from former imperial powers, but not considered by the League of Nations to be capable of self-rule. So the British were given a mandate, the British Mandate for Mesopotamia, to govern the territory and to bring it towards self-rule, which they did in conjunction with the appointed Iraqi monarch Faisal until 1932. And as a result, some of the most important records for Iraq in that period are in the files of the National Archives in London, and in particular in the files of the Colonial Office, who oversaw British administration in Iraq. This March, in 2023, we completed a cataloguing project on some of these records, the series C0730, which contains correspondence sent to the Colonial Office from and about Iraq. The project catalogued correspondence that is bound into large books or volumes, like the one shown on the slide, and over nearly 5 years, and through a global pandemic, a small group of volunteers, Mac, Janet, Anna, and later Rebecca, meticulously worked their way through 104 of these volumes, each containing hundreds of files of letters. The volunteers recorded the subject of each file within the volume and its covering dates, and created new item-level descriptions. On this slide, you can see a snapshot from the catalogue discovery as it would appear on a web browser. And where before you had just one entry, for example, CO730/27, which really just described that whole book that we saw in the last page, this catalogue entry is now subdivided into tens and sometimes more than 100 individual item-level descriptions. So the result is that what was previously only identifiable in the catalogue as a volume of correspondence about Iraq from a particular year has been immeasurably enriched. And an important benefit of this work is that we can now search different topics by keyword much more precisely, and we can more easily track the stories of individual lives through the correspondence, such as that of the Hanania brothers. And to illustrate this benefit of the cataloguing work, I'm going to explore 3 further stories that were revealed by the cataloguing of CO730, all of which come from the same year, 1922. All 3 stories offer windows into the remarkable lives and travels of individuals from and through Iraq in the 1920s, connecting Baghdad not only with London, where the Colonial Office sat and where the records are today, but with other sites around the globe, almost the entire globe, from Marseille in France to Havana in Cuba, Chicago in the United States, Georgia in Eastern Europe, Mumbai in India, and Shanghai in China. This period after the First World War saw huge political shifts and the reshaping of states and identity in many parts of the world, including in this area that became Iraq. And what is especially clear in CO730 is the attempt to set up forms of paperwork that could track and manage those changes to status and identity of individuals. So, for example, here we see a document held in CO730-2782 from January 1922, where various different parts of the government, different British officials, are trying to agree on the wording for an application form for a laissez-passer, a form of travel document for those who are resident in Iraq. And I think often we think of citizenship as fairly binary, something that's just agreed or denied by the state. However, because both the paperwork and legal interpretations of it were in flux in that period, there were many cases that the British government found difficult to adjudicate. And the story of the Hanania brothers echoes an idea of citizenship's right being more on a kind of legal spectrum, as the historian Sarah Stein describes it, which individuals and states are shifting up and down and negotiating. And this cataloguing work helps readers who use our archives identify some of those trends in state bureaucracy more easily, but most importantly, it makes those human stories behind them more visible, and interestingly, the global scope of those individuals' journeys and experiences. So the first story is one about which I've only been able to find out fragments. It's the story of an Iraqi who, the Colonial Office is informed, is in Havana, Cuba. His name is Joseph or Yusuf Georges Andreos, also known as Abdul Karim, and he describes himself as a member of a Kurdish tribe. He had left Iraq in May 1922 and travelled to Marseille, where the French had reissued him identity documents in which he was incorrectly described as Syrian. So he's now in Havana, and he wants to get a visa to travel to the United States, but he doesn't have the right papers to do that. And here on screen we see the letter from the British consul in Havana which describes his case. For at least some of the journey, Andreos had travelled with a reverend of the Nestorian Church, and Andreos describes himself wishing to travel to another Nestorian community in Chicago. The Nestorian Church was one of several Christian sects that was based predominantly in the Middle East, but that already by the 10th century had bishops both in India and in China. Religious persecution meant that by the early 20th century there was a huge Nestorian diaspora who'd spread out from the Middle East around the world. Members of the Nestorian Church in Iraq, in particular, had been persecuted under the Ottoman Empire and allied themselves to the British in the First World War. What we know about Andreos is only that in this case the British government agreed to award him the papers he needed in order to declare his Iraqi rather than Syrian origins and get the papers that he needed to travel to Chicago. The second story that I'm going to pick out of these volumes from 1922 isn't linked to an individual, a single name, but it does point to an important moment in the history of refugee rights. It's correspondence relating to refugees from the Caucasus who are in Iraq in 1922. The letter that you see on screen is from the British Armenian Committee in London, who are petitioning the Colonial Office for assistance. The file records that there were 9,000 refugees in Iraq who were due to travel to Batumi, a city in today's Georgia. Batumi was suffering from food shortages in the wake of the First World War, so was very short of supplies itself. And the British Armenian Committee was worried that if the refugees travelled there without their own supplies, then they would be at extreme risk. The scale of the movement of people through and from the South Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia and Azerbaijan, as well as through Iraq and Turkey in the 1920s, was completely unprecedented. The historical persecution of religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire and in the Russian Empire had displaced many people before the First World War, and the Russian Revolution also had created further mass migration. And then in the wake of the First World War and this huge new wave of refugee movement through to Europe, the Middle East and beyond, all of this led to the creation of an entirely new system of documentation for refugees that began, in fact, in the year 1922 and was called the Nansen Passport. The Nansen Passport was a project of Fridtjof Nansen, a Norwegian, who was the High Commissioner for Refugees at the League of Nations. Various international agreements led to reciprocal arrangements between 52 governments, and all of them agreed to provide temporary asylum for refugees, but also allowed a refugee to take their paperwork onward to other countries where they might have had family or other contacts or prospects, hence the Nansen Passport. Here on the screen now is a specimen version of a Nansen Passport, this special form of documentation, which is now held at the Norwegian National Library. The precarious position of these refugees in Iraq points to another way in which the post-First World War political landscape was creating new processes for regulating identity. In the end, before the Nansen Passport scheme came to a close in 1938, nearly 500,000 Nansen passports were issued, which really gives an indication of this huge scale of forced migration in that period, and helps us think about what this conjunction between paperwork and identity meant for those who were most at risk. The final story that I'm going to share today from 1922 is that of Bensayan Aaron Somak. Here on screen we have more correspondence about disputed status and rights. Somek is a member of a large Iraqi Jewish community in Shanghai, China, who were primarily in business as merchants. Somek, in fact, died not long after this exchange in 1927 with an estate of value that was estimated to be, in today's terms, about $300 million. So he was a very wealthy individual. And as we see from his biography that he sends into the consul in Shanghai, he was born in Baghdad, again while it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and had lived in India for 4 years, but had since been resident in Shanghai. And he, like the Hanania brothers, was seeking to understand what his status was now that Iraq was British. The trading networks of the Iraqi Jewish diaspora through India to China had been very useful to the British Empire in the 19th century, and they had offered many individuals in the diaspora naturalization, citizenship in return. However, by the early 20th century, the British were becoming more reluctant to offer legal protection to this community, either via naturalization or even via the status of protected person, which is a lesser kind of status in which the individual didn't have full rights but could still ask for some assistance from British embassies and consuls. And as described in a letter from the consul in Shanghai to the Colonial Office, that this was a shift and a kind of stricter interpretation of legal guidance. In 1911, the Chinese had overthrown the imperial government, and the whole country was becoming politically much less stable. So for the Iraqi Jewish community in China, including Somek, and despite his wealth, British protection was becoming increasingly important because their lives and their livelihoods were more often at risk. So on the left, we see that letter from Somek, which outlines his biography and the case that he's making for British protection, not only for himself, but also for his sons, age 11, 8, and 3, who were born in China. And on the right, we see that note from the consul to the Foreign Office, which was then forwarded to the Colonial Office, in which the consul expresses doubts about adhering too strictly to regulations in Somek's case, and in fact that of many of the community. As he says, he feels that denying them protected status would be, practically speaking, dispossessing them of their own nationality. Somek's application for British protection was rejected, as were many in that period, on the grounds, as the British officials write, that it doesn't appear that he's planning to resume permanent residency in Iraq. And there are several similar cases appearing in the records through the 1920s. Interestingly, in 1931, just a few years later, the British Supreme Court in Shanghai ruled that the administration of the will of another Jewish Iraqi businessman, Silas Hardoon, did fall under British jurisdiction. And this was surprising because Silas Hardoon, like Ben Sion Somek, had been denied British protection twice in the years before his death. We see again here the ways in which these forms of identity negotiated through the correspondence that's circulating between lawyers, the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office, and the ways in which access to rights might shift and change as the kinds of paperwork and discussions around those rights are also changing. The legacy of the Iraqi Jewish community in Shanghai was nonetheless considerable and deserves another presentation just in itself. But I wanted to point out that it can be seen even in the cityscape. So here on this slide, we have two images of the Ohel Reshel synagogue in Shanghai that was built in 1921 by the Jewish Iraqi community. And one picture, the one on the left, is from around the time of the correspondence in CO 730, at the time that the synagogue was built. And one on the right is showing it still standing in 2013. So that legacy of the Jewish Iraqi community is very much still part of the cityscape. This is the last of the stories from CO 730 for today, although there are many, many, many more to uncover. The complications of their paperwork and their legal status have left us a trail to follow these individuals from and through Iraq to nearly the entire globe. Again, I'd like to emphasize that all this history and all these histories are made much more visible through the incredible cataloguing work done by TNA volunteers. Thank you again, Mac, Janet and Anna in particular, for your contributions in making these amazing stories more accessible, but also thank you to you, the audience, for listening. Thank you.